All right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Congressman Pittenger, for inviting me back to the Parliamentary Intelligence Security Forum. J.C. Boggs for the introduction. My colleague here, Ambassador Carla Sands, who has offered you a superb sort of high-altitude perspective on Trump foreign policy, more broadly in the context of the national security strategy that was just released several days ago, and especially the importance of not only IMEC specifically, but how projects like IMEC fit into the, I think, the larger Trumpian concept of economic statecraft, commercial geography, with an ultimate goal of capitalist peace, where that is viable. It's very ambitious, ladies and gentlemen, and it's going to come under significant debate. It already has over the last 4 or 5 days. But I think what the Trump administration is seeking to accomplish here is to lay out a new vision for global relations after 30 years of the world trying to figure out what does a quote-unquote post-Cold War world look like. And the fact that we have referred to the last 30, 35 years as post-Cold War means that we're kind of stuck in a Cold War mentality, and we really haven't adapted to the very different global landscape that we're dealing with today. So we'll try to see to what extent this Trumpian security strategy, A, will actually be implementable in the months and years ahead. What I'd like to do is build on Ambassador Sands' presentation and try to hone in on specifically East Asia and Europe. Those are sort of the two more controversial areas of the security strategy, and then lay out where this fits into a longer-term Trump administration process over the next several years. Now, you all know, those of you who have either had an opportunity to read what's really a very concise document. It's only 33 pages long, much shorter than previous national security strategies. And also keep in mind, because President Trump is not your conventional politician, you have to stop thinking about what his administration is doing in terms of the way things have always been done in the US. This is not one of these 100-page, we're going to look at every single region of the world, every single functional issue, and lay out for our adversaries what exactly we intend to do type document. It is not that at all by design. And you know that the Trump administration really doesn't care what its critics have to say about the way it operates. This is a very blunt, stark document that lays out the priorities of the Trump administration from a security perspective. And obviously the Western Hemisphere is now going to be an area of reconcentration and refocus in a way that it hasn't been maybe since the 1980s under the Reagan administration, right, when we had communist insurgencies in Central America and in the Caribbean, or even going back to the 1960s with President John F. Kennedy's very ambitious speeches about building stronger ties between the US and our Western Hemispheric neighbors. But what I see here really is a sense of building on what President Trump spoke about right after the election last year about the importance of the Panama Canal and making sure those shipping lanes are open for 40% of all American trade with Asia passes through the Panama Canal. So Hong Kong companies that control access to the Atlantic and Pacific ports that come into the ultimate control of the Chinese Communist Party is an unacceptable situation for the United States. And similarly with Greenland, with all due respect to our allies in Denmark, Madam Ambassador, realistically, with the rise in joint Russian and Chinese air and naval patrols in the Arctic region, Denmark is essentially unable to genuinely protect Greenland from that kind of malign activity in the Arctic region. And that's where the US is looking to build some type of a new condominium with Greenland, especially if that territory becomes independent. So just so we have these types of defense condominiums with a number of countries in Oceania, with Micronesia and other free states there. They're independent, but we have very close defense cooperation with those island nations, so we may see an outcome in Greenland. But we also have a massive naval armada now massed in the Caribbean, just north of Venezuela. And let me offer a couple of insights there, ladies and gentlemen, because Venezuela is not simply, from my perspective, and I'm just speaking very subjectively, and it's my personal opinion here, most of the rhetoric is focused on narco-terrorism. But I think what you have here is also the importance of the U.S.-Mexico border being the last line of defense against narco-trafficking and money laundering and human trafficking and illicit trade, as we heard from our first panelists. And so this is going to be a very forward defense deep into the Western Hemisphere, targeting Venezuela first, but not only because of the narcotics that are coming into the U.S., because we're still dealing with a major fentanyl crisis emanating from the connection between Chinese chemical agents and drug cartels in Mexico, but also the fact that we have a malign Chinese presence, debt diplomacy with Venezuela, being able to obtain very deeply discounted oil in exchange for building infrastructure in Venezuela. So we have a malign Chinese presence in Venezuela. Russia continues to provide significant military hardware and military training for the Maduro forces to repress the democratic opposition in Venezuela. And Iran and its Hezbollah proxy have very deep claws into the Venezuelan government. Money laundering, narcotics trafficking, much of which is used to build up Hezbollah's terrorist activities in the Middle East and in Europe. So we have China, Russia, and Iran engaged in Venezuela, and this new Trump national security strategy makes very clear we look to expel hostile forces, malign hostile forces from the Western Hemisphere where they may be, and to deter them from engaging in such manner in the future. So I think it was this morning, it was just released, there was another interview that President Trump just gave with Politico, where he was asked if the president might be considering similar types of maneuvers in other countries, and I think they specifically spoke about Mexico and Colombia to deal again with narcotics trafficking, which the administration is now reclassifying essentially as terrorist organizations that affect the health and well-being of American society and American security, so that, as I mentioned at the outset of my remarks, it's a very forward defense, the way that we conducted during 20 years of wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan, killed the terrorists there so they don't harm Americans here. It's a very forward defense in the Western Hemisphere, so we're not dealing with the kind of mass migration we had over the last half decade that has caused tremendous social upheaval in so many parts of the United States. With the Indo-Pacific now and the Euro-Atlantic, what's interesting is that you don't really see the kind of great power competition language regarding China that we've had not only under the Biden national security strategy, but even the first Trump administration. And I think President Trump's perspective here is very sort of multidimensional. One is that President Trump is now engaged in very serious sort of strategic trade talks with China. And from President Trump's perspective, there's no reason to sort of pour gasoline on the fire and anger the Chinese and embarrass them publicly when we're trying to secure very important trade outcomes in these talks. Now, one can agree or disagree, but this is simply how President Trump's mindset operates. And he doesn't like to offend very powerful leaders that he needs to come into some type of agreement with him. And we see this playing out with Putin as well, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I think what you also see is you need to read between the lines, ladies and gentlemen. I think President Trump's White House feels you don't have to come out and say that we're obviously involved in a strategic, economic, military, and technological competition with China. That's self-evident. I think what President Trump is looking to explain here is, A, first of all, we want to have as normal an economic relationship and trade relationship based on fair trade with China on non-sensitive sectors. We are going to have to wean ourselves from dependence on China for rare earth elements, as we saw in recent months, playing out with President Xi retaliating against tariff threats and the like from the Trump administration, but also pharmaceuticals, ladies and gentlemen. As we learned during the COVID pandemic, China has an almost iron grip on the essential active pharmaceutical ingredients that we need to keep all of our societies healthy, not only in the United States, but almost every country in the world depends on access to China's iron grip over pharmaceuticals and chemicals that are required for antibiotics and penicillin and the like. So there's going to be a long-term effort to reshore and rebuild rare earth processing and refining capabilities to bring pharmaceuticals manufacturing away from China and have ourselves become more sovereign and more independent on sectors that are required for national security and societal well-being. But also read between the lines, we're making very clear we intend to very effectively deter China and to deny it the ability to invade Taiwan, and beyond that, to even be able to push the US and other countries away from the first island chain just off the coast of China. President Trump has made very clear we will operate as freely as we need to be in international waters and international airspace in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, which is also mentioned specifically in the strategy. Because of the importance of the shipping lanes where 1/3 of the world's annual commerce passes through the South China Sea. So yes, we want to have a non-ideological competition. I'm not sure that's doable with the very Leninist mindset inside the Communist Party leadership in Beijing. But economic relations in non-sensitive sectors, no invasion of Taiwan, keeping the shipping lanes open in the South China Sea, but also importantly, no unilateral declaration of independence by Taiwan that would then give China the pretext to invade or to blockade the island and force a decision in the White House whether to come to Taiwan's defense. We don't want a war with China over Taiwan, ladies and gentlemen, and I think the administration is making that very clear. Euro-Atlantic. This is the one that's got all of our European allies' hair standing over the last 4 or 5 days. But I would ask our European friends to look at this document a little bit differently, because I think it's a message of tough love from the administration to our European friends that, first of all, many countries in probably, if you ask the Trump White House officials, mostly in quote-unquote Western Europe, not so much in Eastern and Central Europe, where the White House seems to have a higher regard for those countries taking on a more active self-defense, a more robust perspective on sovereignty and national primacy, especially countries like Poland, which will likely be the first country to achieve a genuine 5% of GDP expenditure on national defense. But we're seeing a number of internal afflictions in Europe. And when I say Europe, ladies and gentlemen, I have to talk about two different definitions. There's NATO, which I think the Trump administration wants to see as robust as possible, to be able to better defend Europe against a supposed Russian threat. And I say supposed because many European countries talk about a Russian threat, but don't seem to realign their budgetary priorities as if they take that Russian threat seriously. If you're Spain and you're spending 1.1% of your GDP on defense, maybe you're not really that afraid of Russia, okay? But there's NATO and there's the European Union. And I think much of the invective in the national security strategy is targeted at the bloated, bureaucratic, administrative state that the European Union has become. And remember, the United States was instrumental in helping to launch the European Union. It was the European Steel and Coal Community back in the 1950s. But that was meant to be a free trade association so that countries that were interdependent on trade hopefully would not have another cataclysmic world war, as we saw with the First and Second World Wars in the prior century. And instead we have, from the Trump administration's perspective, an unaccountable bloc that has not been elected by any of the people of various European countries that is using this administrative state to bypass sovereignty and to bypass national primacy of European countries and to impose more coercive controls over the lives of everyday Europeans. And whether it's mass immigration or mass migration, which no European citizen has ever voted for, this is all coming out of Brussels bureaucracy, or this climate fanaticism that we see that has led to the deindustrialization of massive, powerful countries like Germany and the United Kingdom, and the degree to which we see multiculturalism that has led to a sort of weakening of pride in various European countries about their own history and civilization. I think President Trump is trying to send a message: we need you, Europe, to be robust, to be strong, to be sovereign, to take your own futures into your hands, and to deal with threats, whether they're from Russia, Iran, or down the road, ladies and gentlemen, if you look south of Europe, we're very concerned about what's happening in Africa, both in terms of demographic explosion, the spread of radical Islamist terrorism in the Sahel region, in the Sahara, that is destabilizing so many countries in Northern Africa, and the degree to which demographic growth exceeds economic development, you're going to have an impact, further migration into Europe in the decades ahead. And the question becomes, what is Europe doing today and tomorrow to deal with this future threat from Northern Africa? So I think most of the invective is targeted towards the European Union, ladies and gentlemen, but I would add also as an American citizen that I think part of it is also a message to our fellow Americans of the dangers of mass uncontrolled migration, of multicultural tendencies in many parts of the United States, of climate policies that led to a weakening of the United States until the shale revolution unleashed horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing so that the United States now is the leading producer of crude oil and the leading producer of natural gas that has given us the resilience and the wherewithal to withstand all of these geopolitical and geoeconomic shocks of the last 10 to 15 years. And I'll just close on this, ladies and gentlemen, with the Middle East and with Africa. The Middle East, Ambassador Sands touched on very importantly, especially the IMEC corridor, which really is kind of a linchpin, if you think about it, towards a new future for the Middle East, away from being notoriously the world's most war-torn region of the world for the last several decades, into one where the U.S. and our allies work with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries and Israel together to build a new future for the region that is based on stabilized politics, on diversification of economies away from petrostates, bringing technology, energy corridors, transportation corridors, and a more hopeful regional strategy based on flourishing and economic prosperity. And then in Africa, to move away from lecturing and hectoring countries on human rights policies and to promote economic development and joint exploration and exploitation of natural resources in ways that offset the kind of malign influence we've seen from China and from Russia throughout the African continent, to help those countries become more liberalized, more consensual, move away from corruption, move away from the incentives that breed terrorism, and bring about a tremendous future for the growing population of Africa, which continent-wise is going to double in population over the next 20 years. And this is going to have an impact on global relations throughout the continent and beyond. So in closing, ladies and gentlemen, let me just note that this security strategy is going to be followed shortly by the National Defense Strategy coming out of the Department of War, as we now have redubbed it here in Washington. And this will lay out how the Defense Department, or pardon me, the War Department, will not only lay out how to better defend the Western Hemisphere, right, putting flesh on the bones of the security strategy, how we will look to deter China effectively regarding Taiwan and the South China Sea, to increase burden sharing with our allies in Asia, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, Australia, India in the Quad network, but also in NATO to get not just Poland, but many of the countries close to 5%, if not at 5%, but also to supercharge the American defense industrial base, which our political leadership in both the Republican and Democratic parties allowed to hollow out over the last 25 years. And now we're entering a period of very significant scaling to catch up to where we need to be able to actually and effectively implement the security strategy and the defense strategy that will follow. So I think I'll close on that, and Congressman Pittenger, I guess maybe if we have time for questions, we'll take them. Thank you very much.